So when it comes to Second Timothy 3, the first thought that comes to mind is the first half of the passage, where it's talking about how the last days are going to be terrible. And how they're going to be people that are brutal, abusive, disobedient to their parents, treacherous, rash, conceited, boastful, proud. Like all of these pointed at self, so much so, rather than being concerned for others. Because, you think about disobedient to your parents, you're focused on obeying yourself. When you're treacherous, you're very self motivated to turn on people. When you're boastful, you're proud, well, that just comes down to thinking you're right, you're above. And it comes down to a place of also not thinking about or wanting to even go to a place of thinking about God, because they'll be lovers of pleasure, what they want to feel, versus how God would feel about these things. They are not lovers of the good, and who is the lover of the good? It's God. And that's what comes to me when it comes to the first half of the passage, and the other part being for that part of the passage is this is inevitable. This is bound to happen. This is what's going to set the tone for the terrible times. And you're going to have these people live this way, and they're going to keep going at it, assuming that they choose not to follow God, assuming that they choose not to become lovers of the good, assuming that they choose not to become lovers of God. And historically, it makes sense. And I have no idea if I'm pronouncing their names right, but as you get to the middle of the passage, it talks about Jannes and Jambres and how they opposed Moses, and how these teachers, and that's another thing, these guys that think they know better, but they don't. They're going to be the ones that oppose the truth, what's coming from God. There will be people teaching these ways of being treacherous, of being rash, of being conceited, being lovers of themselves, lovers of money, lovers of things that are not good. And we're warned that these people are people of depraved minds. We're warned that they're going to be tricksters. They're the ones that are going to worm their way into homes and convince the gullible folk of doing these things and continuing to add on to the terrible days. And they're the ones that are going to be doing these things, and smiles on, being suave and being able to convince these people, hey, I know what I'm doing. But they're the ones that are going to also be very loaded down with all these sins, as the passage talks about. That kind of makes sense, because, you see all these people in the eyes of the public. They're so great at music, at sports, at some sort of talent. But then behind the scenes, when the paparazzi shows up, you see that they're being exposed in ways. Illicit affairs, brutality towards people they love, or even animals, drugs, dealing with money in illegal ways. The list goes on. And they're the ones that are going to be, some of them, not all of them, granted, but some of them are going to be the ones that are following in suit with the people that are depraved in their minds. And the Bible tells us through this passage, don't have anything to do with them. I mean, granted, I feel like there's a time and place for somebody to reach out to them, but I think what I'm picking up is don't have anything to do with their ways. Because then the second half of the passage is what's really encouraging throughout all this. That even though all this is going on around us, and all of it is expected we're encouraged to keep moving forward. We're encouraged to continue following what we've been taught, because we know what we've been taught. We know those who taught us. We know that they're not the ones that are worming their ways into the lives of other people and taking advantage of them. We know that they're not the ones that are choosing to be loaded down with sin. They're the ones that have been freed by Christ. I mean, it starts with a warning that these are the people that these are the people that want to continue following Jesus. And the warning comes down to, in fact, anyone who wants to live a life of godliness through Jesus Christ will be persecuted. But it also comes with a place of empathy, I feel, in the sense of our writer to Timothy, Paul, is going on saying, but you know my way of life, you know my teachings, you know my purpose, patience, faith, love, and endurance. You know my persecutions, you know my sufferings. Paul gets it. And he also shares how even though he went through all this, throughout all these cities in what's like modern day Turkey, I believe, God delivered him from all of it. He says that. And that's where I find encouragement, in the sense of like, even though you are bound to be persecuted for following Jesus Christ, even though you might be going through some terrible stuff, God rescued me from it, which presents the message of God will rescue you from it. Now that's encouraging, that even though persecution is the path that's ahead of us, we're going to be okay. And that we're left with either going in the path of the people that were mentioned at the beginning of the passage, where they were depraved in mind and self-loving and not lovers of themselves. Big difference, I feel. But nonetheless, lovers of themselves, lovers of money, brutal, disobedient to their parents. There's that bit that's identifying them where they will have a form of godliness, which is another point that comes to mind. God still blesses us and gives us, even if we choose not to go his way and do things for his purpose. And that makes sense, because like in the Old Testament, there was a prophet that was mentioned for being able to hear from God and being able to warn a king of like an enemy to the Israelites, but he was able to hear God and tell this king, hey, you shouldn't do that. And he was right. And from my recollection, his name is Balaam. And he's credited for being able to like actually listen to God, but he's also credited for pointing the Israelites in a very terrible direction. And I see that here, because there's that verse that goes, having a form of godliness but denying its power. And the other part going to always learning, but never able to come to a knowledge of the truth. And that keeps reminding me of being taught at church that people get big heads. People go to church, and rather than getting to know Christ, they get to know the Bible as this textbook, and they get all this head knowledge, and they don't use any of it. It's just stored away in there, and it's essentially faith without action a lot of the time. It's head knowledge rather than direction, something to obey. So rather than coming to the truth, coming to a knowledge of the truth by actually taking action on what they've learned, they just keep learning. And so you'll have all these clever people out there that are able to quote the Bible, are able to make sense of the Bible in some way or form as a textbook, as a historical reference, maybe at best, maybe even as a philosophical bit. But by the end of the day, they don't find Jesus in it. And you know, what does that lead to? Just legalism. These people that'll just point fingers and judge all the time, rather than what the last bit of this passage brings us, that God gave us the word as a tool to equip us as servants, to be used for teaching, rebuking, correcting, training in righteousness. These are all actions outside of just learning. I mean, with learning, you're just stuck with learning. But with teaching, you have left the platform of learning and you have now gotten to a place to teach and help others learn. For rebuking, it only makes sense to rebuke if you have some direction to help them. Because if your rebuke is going to work, it helps to actually have a connection with God versus just pointing a finger and saying, "Hey, what you're doing is very wrong. Stop that," or just being upset with them. Correcting, you must. I would like the first thought that comes to me is you either know the truth well and you've lived it, that you've avoided the path of having to be corrected in the first place, or something I'm very familiar with, the idea that you have been corrected and you know why. And now when correction, the path to correct someone comes your way, you're able to help them. And of course, training brings me to a place of developing discipline, developing growth and strength. Just because I've been going to the gym and that's what I see. And when you go to the word, when you go to these passages, you go into spiritual training in some way or form. And it all comes down to servants. Because that last verse of this passage is talking about equipping servants. And what do servants do? We serve. These are all aspects to help us serve. And not just get head knowledge, not just learn a bunch of facts, learn a historical timeline. What I see here in its fullness is Paul being very loving towards Timothy, very loving towards all of us Christians, when he shares these words that the end times are going to come and they are going to be difficult. The end times are going to come, and along the way there will be people that are very against you and doing things very opposite to you. But he also encourages us in the sense of, you've been taught, you know that these people who have taught you are loving and caring. You know them. You know that the Holy Spirit's there. You've been able, there's mention of, you've been taught of Holy Scripture from infancy. It's from my understanding, he's talking to Timothy directly, but there are a lot of us that grew up in this faith, and that is a growth in itself. Very different from someone who came to Christ when they were like 25. Having that leg up makes a big difference. I'm not saying it makes a big difference in terms of one being better than another, but it just helps out in a lot of ways in being able to have that blessing from a young age. Um, but yeah, uh, it does come down to a place of, yes, we've been warned, but we're also being encouraged in the sense of like, you know what's right, stick to it. And as you stick to it, remember that it doesn't just sit. It is to be used as a tool to help others, including yourself. And for me personally, what stuck out was the idea that, one, we're in it. We're in these terrible times. Maybe it's not the last days, but it's starting to look a lot like the last days. But also just God had a plan for us in writing this letter through Paul to Timothy. Initially addressed to Timothy, but really addressed to us to help us and not just fall to defeat, but to be encouraged. And I find that encouragement. And I find that in the season of my life where a lot of overthinking occurs, a lot of things taken personally occurs, I'm able to find new direction and peace in something that I've taken the time to memorize and see a new depth to this passage in the sense of don't just have your gift from God. Acknowledge its power, acknowledge where it came from, and use it to serve, use it to help others. And of course, as the road gets tougher, don't be surprised. That's just how it's going to be in the terrible times. Don't be surprised in the sense that this is bound to happen when people aren't going to God. And of course, be encouraged that you already know what's right. And all you gotta do is just keep moving forward. So those were my thoughts on 2 Timothy 3.